Think about the last time you saw something wrong and said nothing. It may have been small, a cruel joke in the break room, a friend being mistreated, a lie left unchallenged. Or maybe it was bigger: injustice in society, corruption in politics, prejudice disguised as policy. And yet, you stayed quiet. You told yourself it wasn't your place, that someone else would speak up, that staying silent was safer. But here's the truth: silence is never neutral. Silence always sides with something. And more often than not, it sides with the very thing you wish would change. That's the weight of silence. It doesn't just protect you, it protects the problem. History has proven this again and again. During the Holocaust, many Germans weren't active participants in violence. They were silent bystanders. In America's civil rights era, millions of people weren't burning crosses, but they weren't raising their voices either. In workplaces, families, schools, silence allows bullies and abusers to thrive. Philosopher Plato warned, "The price of apathy toward public affairs is to be ruled by evil men." And centuries later, theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer echoed it. Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. Why do their words still sting today? Because they point to the same uncomfortable reality. Good people don't need to be cruel for darkness to win. They just need to be quiet. And yet, most people don't stay silent because they don't care. They stay silent because they're afraid. Afraid of conflict. Afraid of standing out. Afraid of what will happen if their voice disrupts the crowd. But fear doesn't erase responsibility, and silence doesn't absolve guilt. Here lies the paradox. The very moments when your voice matters most are the moments when it feels hardest to use it. And that's where our story begins. Because to understand why darkness wins, you don't need to study villains. You only need to study silence. Which brings us to the first reason people stay quiet. One we all know too well: the fear of conflict. Conflict feels dangerous. Your heart races, your chest tightens, your mind whispers, "Stay quiet, stay safe." This isn't weakness, it's biology. When you anticipate confrontation, the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, goes into overdrive. It floods your body with cortisol and adrenaline, preparing you for fight or flight. Even if the threat is only a tense conversation with your boss or telling a friend they've crossed a line, your nervous system reacts as if you were facing a predator. That's why silence feels like protection. It lowers the immediate tension. It preserves the illusion of peace, at least for the moment. But here's the paradox. By avoiding the short-term discomfort of conflict, you create long-term harm. Silence shields the aggressor. It protects the manipulator. It gives power to the loudest, not the wisest. And the one who suffers most is not just the victim of injustice, but you, carrying the weight of words unsaid. Psychologists call this conflict avoidance, and it's been studied for decades. In the 1970s, researcher Morton Deutsch showed how fear of confrontation led groups to settle for false peace instead of productive disagreement. Later studies in organizational psychology revealed that workplaces where employees avoided conflict in the name of harmony often became toxic cultures, because problems left unspoken only grew worse. And this isn't limited to offices. A 2016 study in the Journal of Business Ethics found that bystanders in harassment cases stayed silent, not because they didn't see what was happening, but because their bodies interpreted speaking up as a threat to their own survival. Conflict avoidance is a reflex, the nervous system trading long-term truth for short-term safety. Think about how often you've walked away from a situation replaying the words you should have said. That's the mark of conflict avoidance, a trade of temporary comfort for lasting regret. And yet, conflict isn't inherently destructive. At its best, it's the spark that exposes lies, protects the vulnerable, and shifts power. But when no one ignites it, silence doesn't stay personal. It spreads through groups, multiplying into something larger: paralysis. When silence enters a group, it changes shape. What begins as hesitation in one person quickly multiplies into paralysis. Psychologists call this the bystander effect, the unsettling truth that the more people witness harm, the less likely any one of them is to intervene. Everyone assumes someone else will step in. Everyone waits, and in that waiting, nothing happens. The theory first emerged in the 1960s, after the murder of Kitty Genovese in New York. Early reports claimed dozens of neighbors heard her cries but did nothing. The story was later shown to be more complex, but the shock of it pushed researchers John Darley and Bibb Latané to investigate. In their famous experiments, they staged emergencies. Smoke filling a room, a stranger collapsing, cries for help. When people were alone, most acted quickly, but in groups, the rate of action plummeted. The presence of others created a silent equation. If no one else is moving, maybe it's not serious. Maybe I shouldn't act either. That hesitation, that pause, is where silence metastasizes. Because once one person stays quiet, it gives permission for the next to stay quiet too. Silence, like yawning, is contagious. You've probably felt it yourself. In meetings, when a cruel comment is made and no one objects. In classrooms, when a wrong answer hangs in the air and everyone looks down. In public spaces, when someone is mistreated and you feel the urge to help, but freeze because no one else moves. The bystander effect reveals something unnerving. Silence doesn't just come from fear of conflict. It comes from fear of standing out. And the larger the crowd, the heavier that fear becomes. Philosopher Hannah Arendt once observed that the greatest evils of history weren't committed by monsters, but by ordinary people who looked away. In groups, responsibility diffuses, and when no one feels accountable, no one acts. But what happens when silence isn't just shaped by the crowd? What happens when it's commanded from above, by power itself? When silence is commanded from above, it takes a different name: obedience. In the early 1960s at Yale, psychologist Stanley Milgram asked a chilling question. Why do ordinary people obey harmful orders? Volunteers thought they were helping with a study on learning. Their task: deliver electric shocks to another person for wrong answers. The shocks weren't real, but the volunteers didn't know that. They heard screams. They heard pleas to stop. They were told the voltage was dangerous, even potentially lethal. And yet, when the man in the white lab coat said, "Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue," most did. 65% went all the way to the maximum 450 volts. What does this tell us? That ordinary people, people who see themselves as decent, moral, even kind, can silence their conscience in the presence of authority. They trade their inner voice for compliance. Milgram wrote, "Ordinary people, simply doing their jobs, can become agents in a terrible, destructive process." Philosophers warned us long before. Hannah Arendt, reflecting on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, called it the banality of evil. Evil often doesn't look monstrous. It looks ordinary. It looks like citizens following rules, clerks stamping forms, functionaries saying, "I was just doing my job." Authority hollows out responsibility, convincing you the weight lies elsewhere, with the leader, the uniform, the system. So silence becomes submission disguised as safety. You see echoes in everyday life, not just in offices. A medical intern follows an unsafe instruction because the attending said so. A co-pilot notices an error, but defers to the captain. A soldier obeys an unjust order because disobedience feels more dangerous than harm itself. Authority doesn't only silence individuals, it reshapes morality. It creates the illusion that to speak up is rebellion, and to stay quiet is virtue. But silence under authority is only part of the story. There's an even subtler force, one that needs no orders at all. A force so quiet most people don't notice it shaping their choices. The pull of the crowd. The pull of the crowd is quiet, but it's powerful. In a group, silence shapeshifts. One person's pause becomes the group's default. Philosophers have long warned about this. Soren Kierkegaard wrote, "The crowd is untruth." He believed that individuals lose their moral compass when they dissolve into the group. Alone, a person might feel responsibility. In the crowd, that responsibility fades, replaced by the comfort of anonymity. Plato hinted at the same danger in his allegory of the cave. People cling to shadows on the wall, not because they believe them deeply, but because everyone else does. To challenge the illusion feels unbearable, so they sit in silence, chained not just by ignorance but by conformity. Centuries later, psychology proved them right. In the 1950s, Solomon Asch ran his conformity experiments. Participants judged the length of lines, an easy task with an obvious answer. But when everyone else in the room, who were secretly actors, gave the wrong answer, most participants conformed. They chose the lie over the truth, not because they believed it, but because they didn't want to stand out. Asch called it the fear of being different. You see versions of this every day. A family group chat where a cruel meme goes unchallenged because no one wants to be that person. A neighborhood meeting where a biased proposal gets polite nods and no questions. A viral comment thread where misinformation snowballs because the crowd seems certain. The silence feels safe, but in reality, it's contagious. Nietzsche called this herd morality, the instinct to go along, to prefer the comfort of belonging over the burden of standing alone. It isn't stupidity, it's survival instinct. But left unchecked, it turns wisdom into weakness, and silence into complicity. And that's the terrifying part. The crowd doesn't just silence individuals, it manufactures a new normal, where truth feels dangerous and lies feel ordinary. So the question isn't only, why do I stay silent? It's, why does silence spread faster than courage? Because underneath that silence lies something deeper, a fear more primal than obedience to authority or conformity to the group. The fear of being left alone. Human beings are wired for connection. Evolution taught us that to be cast out from the tribe meant death, and even today, that ancient wiring lives on. We fear social rejection as intensely as physical pain. Neuroscientists have shown this with fMRI scans. When people experience exclusion, being left out of a game, ignored by peers, mocked by a group, the brain lights up in the same regions that register physical injury. Social pain isn't just a metaphor, it hurts. And that pain explains why silence can feel safer than speaking. To raise your voice is to risk rejection. To stay quiet is to remain inside the circle, even if the circle is wrong. Philosophers saw this truth long before neuroscience confirmed it. Aristotle called man a zoon politikon, a political, social animal. To him, life outside the community wasn't just lonely, it was incomplete. Kierkegaard went further, warning that the greatest despair is not to be yourself, but to lose yourself in the crowd, just to avoid being alone. Silence, then, disguises itself as safety, but beneath it lies despair. The despair of abandoning your own truth just to keep belonging. Think about it. How many times have you bitten your tongue in a conversation? Not because you agreed, but because you didn't want to be the odd one out. How often do people laugh at a cruel joke, not because it's funny, but because they fear the silence that comes with disapproval? This is how the fear of isolation trains us to conform, not out of conviction, but out of survival. Psychologist Abraham Maslow placed belonging at the very center of his hierarchy of needs, right above food and safety. It's that fundamental. Without belonging, even the strongest among us feel vulnerable, which is why silence spreads so easily. Each person believes they're protecting themselves, but together, they create an atmosphere where truth itself feels dangerous to say. This is the paradox. Silence protects us from loneliness in the short term, but in the long term, it creates the very isolation we fear. Because when everyone stays quiet, genuine connection, the kind built on honesty, disappears. And what's left is not belonging, but a fragile performance of it. So, if isolation is what we fear most, the next question is, how do those in power use that fear to keep us quiet? Silence isn't always born of fear. Sometimes it's trained into us long before we realize it. Not by dictators, not by threats, but by culture itself. From our earliest years, we're taught that obedience is safer than honesty. Schools praise the child who sits quietly, not the one who asks the uncomfortable question. Workplaces reward team players, even if that means swallowing concerns. Families, often with good intentions, tell us not to make a scene. Slowly, we learn a script. Keep the peace, don't rock the boat, fit in. Philosopher John Stuart Mill warned about this in the 19th century. In On Liberty, he argued that society doesn't only silence through law, it silences through opinion. The tyranny of the majority, he called it. Not the fear of prison, but the fear of social disapproval. When the crowd decides what's acceptable, the individual voice shrinks to survive. Psychology backs this up. Social learning theory shows how we model our behavior on rewards and punishments, not just from authority, but from peers. Children who challenge teachers are often punished, while those who quietly conform are praised. Adults replicate the same dynamic at work, in politics, even online. Over time, silence doesn't feel like avoidance anymore. It feels like maturity, professionalism, even virtue. And cultures reinforce this in different ways. In Japan, the concept of wa, harmony, discourages open disagreement. To challenge the group is seen as disrespectful, even selfish. In the West, those who challenge corporate or political norms are often branded negative or unpatriotic, punished not just by authorities, but by the court of public opinion. Different settings, same lesson. Silence keeps you safe. But here's the danger. What starts as politeness becomes paralysis. The very habits that once kept order end up suppressing truth. Mill believed that progress depends on free voices, even eccentric ones, because they challenge the dead dogma of the majority. Without those voices, cultures stagnate. Silence becomes not just a personal choice, but a cultural inheritance. And so, the weight of silence is more than fear. It's tradition. It's expectation. It's the invisible training we all receive, to keep the peace, even when peace is a lie. Which leads us to the turning point. If silence is so deeply woven into fear, authority, conformity, and even culture, what finally breaks it? Throughout history, silence has been the norm, but so has its breaking. And often, it begins not with the loudest person in the room, but with the one who simply refuses to stay quiet. Think of Rosa Parks in 1955. One act of defiance, keeping her seat on a bus, ignited a movement. Parks herself said she was tired, not just physically, but tired of giving in. Her refusal broke the silence of segregation, showing others that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it sits still and says, "No more." Or consider the whistleblowers of modern times. People like Sharon Watkins at Enron or Frances Haugen at Facebook. Individuals who risked careers and reputations to expose corruption. Psychologists call this moral courage, the willingness to face personal cost for the sake of truth. It's not the absence of fear, but the decision that integrity matters more than safety. Philosophers give us language for this too. Viktor Frankl, who endured Nazi concentration camps, wrote that the ultimate freedom is the space between stimulus and response, the power to choose our stance, even when everything else is stripped away. Silence may be the conditioned response, but choice is what breaks it. And psychology confirms how rare yet powerful these breakthroughs are. In the 1960s, Serge Moscovici's experiments on minority influence showed that even two dissenting voices could shift a group's perception of color. Later studies reinforced this. When someone dares to break silence, it destabilizes conformity. It creates cracks in the wall where others can find their courage. The examples stretch across cultures. Václav Havel writing truth under a regime of lies. Malala Yousafzai refusing to be silenced about education, even when it put her life at risk. These remind us that silence isn't inevitable. It feels heavy, it feels permanent, but it only takes one fracture to undo it. The deeper question then is not just what shatters silence, but why some people find that courage while others don't. And that's where philosophy points us back. Not to the crowd, not to the culture, but to the individual. Silence may feel collective, but breaking it is always personal. It begins the moment you realize that waiting for others is just another form of surrender. Philosophers and psychologists alike remind us that courage doesn't arrive fully formed. Aristotle described virtue as a habit, practiced, strengthened, lived. In the same way, Breaking silence is not a single heroic act, but a pattern we build. Each time you speak when it's uncomfortable, you weaken the grip of fear. Each time you refuse to go along with a lie, you loosen the weight of conformity. Psychologist Albert Bandura argued that people learn through modeling, watching others act and realizing they can too. That means your courage, however small, becomes contagious. When you break silence, you don't just free yourself, you give others permission to do the same. That's how cultures shift, not all at once, but voice by voice. But the choice is never abstract. It comes in everyday moments. When someone makes a cruel joke and you decide not to laugh. When you see a wrong at work and choose not to look away. When you risk saying the truth, even if it costs you approval. These are the acts that slowly turn silence into voice, and voice into change. Still, the temptation to stay quiet never disappears, because silence always offers comfort, always offers belonging. But as history shows us, comfort bought with silence is fragile. It protects nothing but the status quo, and the status quo is where injustice thrives. Nietzsche once said, "A man's worth is determined by how much truth he can tolerate." The question is not whether silence matters. We already know it does. The question is, when it's your turn, will you protect your comfort or your conscience? Because in the end, silence doesn't just let darkness exist, it lets it win. Now it's your turn. Share in the comments. What's one moment where you wish you had spoken but didn't? Or better yet, what's one moment where you did? Your story might be the spark that helps someone else find their voice. And if this message stirred something in you, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because together, we're building a space where silence no longer has the last word.